Welcome. We are so happy to have all of you here and all of you on Zoom on this, the 103rd birthday of the League of Women Voters. So I think we need a round of applause. 2 more years and we can celebrate 105. So I think that's wonderful. I'm Nancy Garland, and I am part of the leadership team for the Lower Cape Fear League of Women Voters. And at this time, we're just kind of rotating leadership positions. So that's why I'm speaking to you today. But in case you don't know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, I emphasize nonpartisan organization, neither supporting or opposing candidates of political parties. We also are fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our league has spent a lot of time discussing this and working on this and hope to do a lot more in this area. And if you'd like to know about our policies and the organization, please go to our website location. We also recognize the tribal lands of the Waccamaw, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, and indigenous people of the Lower Cape Fear. Okay, it's not going again. It froze. So sorry about this. I can't see it. The PowerPoint doesn't like us a lot. So how many people have been here for the first time to the league? Wow, that's wonderful. How many of you are members of the league? Great. So if you're not a member of the league, we'd love to have you. And Bonnie is sitting, Bertrand is sitting right there, and she can provide you with an application form. So we would love to have you. So we'll wait. And again, I don't know how many we actually have on Zoom, but it's quite a few. So we're really looking forward to our speaker. It's just that a PowerPoint is not cooperating with us, unfortunately. We'll get it soon, I promise. How many are from North Carolina, from Wilmington originally? Oh, originally, yeah. Okay, so it looks like we have four people. You lucky people to have lived here all this time. I'm from Ohio, and I'm really happy to be here. Though I lived in DC for 25 years, so which was a great experience too. But the weather here certainly is much better than either one of those places. So, okay. I can't speak yet. Oh, yes. We're going to be taking photos at today's event. We've already started doing that, actually, to be included on our newsletter or posted on our website. So if you would prefer your picture not to be exhibited in this way, please let us know, and we'll make sure that you're not included. Bonnie?
I have this little gadget for things, so if anyone wants to renew their membership, everyone will join, and you can use a credit card.
Okay, are we ready for the final part of mine? Is just to let you know of upcoming events that we're going to be involved in is the North Carolina Rice Festival, which is March 2nd through the 4th, and the Gullah Geechee Heritage Dinner is on Friday, March the 3rd. Which I think they're going to have a very famous 5-star chef that's fixing the food. Saturday, March the 4th, the Rice Festival events actually start at Brunswick Town and Fort Anderson Historic Site. And then on March the 18th, and we would encourage you all to come, we are having what we're calling a listening session from 10 a.m. to noon. at the New Hanover Library Northeast branch over in the Mayfair area. And this is going to be a very interactive session for us to listen to our members to find out what you would like us to be working on. And so we can let you know what we've achieved in the past and what our current priorities are, because we are sticking to our strategic plan to make sure that we're following it. So we would love for you to come to 2 hours on March the 18th. And then the other thing, which I'm also very excited about, the new hot topic will be April the 11th, Gen Z on college campuses. And we know they are so critical to the next election. We need to get young people involved. And Carol O'Neill, who is a UNCW faculty member, is teaching the course to the new freshmen. And we're going to be meeting in the Brunswick Beer and Cider. If you haven't been there yet, it's in Brunswick Forest. And those of us that live in Brunswick County really like the brewery. We had our last luncheon there, and we have found out that we have a lot of members that live in Brunswick County. And so we're trying to move our meetings around so we can accommodate people from different parts of the league. So, but I think that is the end of mine. And now I'm going to introduce Leslie Antos, who is Miss Everything. She is the past co-leadership, and now she's our secretary, and she's in charge of our hot topics.
Thank you. Okay, hi. As Nancy said, my name is Leslie Antos, and I am secretary of League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear. Closer. Okay. And it's my honor to be able to introduce Dr. Prokopa to you. So Dr. Narcissa Prokopa is a professor in the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences at UNCW. She's originally from Romania. Dr. Prokopa received a bachelor's degree in geography and English from Bobis Bolja University in Cluj-Napoca, a master's degree in geosciences from Western Kentucky University, and holds a PhD in geography from the University of Florida. Her research focuses on complex socio-ecological systems dynamics, especially centered on understanding and quantifying environmental variability and the vulnerability of populations to environmental changes. To date, Dr. Prokopa has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles on the various aspects of integrating Earth observation, remote sensing, and drone photogrammetry with spatiotemporal modeling to advance human well-being. Can't you already tell we're all going to be tons smarter after we're done with this talk today? I know we're all excited to have Dr. Prokopa here with us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leslie. And let's see. Thank you for having me here today. Is this okay? Well, hopefully I will be throwing none of that jargon at you today. So don't worry about it. I'll do my best to not say any of those words. Can you hear me? Is it okay in Zoom land, or should I move it higher? Higher, right here? It's as high as it goes without holding the microphone. Okay, so thank you again today for having me. Before I get going, I would like to acknowledge my various graduate students and my colleague Joanne Halls, who has worked with me on some of these topics in the past. Former students include Lauren Rosul, Christopher Hidalgo, and Greer Shivers, who are all did amazing small parts of this work that I'll be presenting today, and they're all off in the world making a difference and working on resilience in different places. Actually, most of them are still here in Wilmington. Am I okay? Yes, so with that said, I am delighted to have been invited to talk a little bit about resilience and vulnerability in our local region. And as Leslie said, I am originally from Romania. I was born and raised in Transylvania, literally about 30 miles from where Dracula actually spent some time. I went to school there, and I've always been really interested in ways of looking at what makes people vulnerable to various environmental changes. So I've done that kind of research prior to coming here to UNCW, which was exactly 10 years ago here soon. I had done similar work in Southern Africa, even in Eastern Africa. I've worked on these topics in Nepal and Peru. So, but I really wanted to develop a local research where I could involve the students and where I could involve communities. So I'm very happy to say that, again, what I'm talking about here today has come a long way since I arrived at UNCW, and I have a lot of really great current projects and upcoming projects that leverage the local community and local collaboration. So I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that contributed to any of the things I'll be talking about today. So I am advancing my slides now. Oh boy. Well, my next slide, it's okay. I don't need the slides. I can just sort of wing it. But my next slide was really pitching a big question, the question that I would like to address with you here today. And that is, what does resilience, what does coastal resilience look like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years from today? Because ultimately, that's what we all want to know. Is this place livable, and how livable is it, and under what conditions, and what do we really need to think about and do today to ensure that the coastal community we all live in is still a safe, livable place in the next few years? So that was the question that I wanted to start off with. And then, what do I mean by resilience? What do we understand by the word resilience? Well, it's typically the ability of communities to adapt to respond to plan for, and for various types of events, unanticipated events that affect sort of our day-to-day livelihood, that affect how we conduct our activities. There you go. So maybe it'll work now. There we go. So yeah. So I have some slides. It would be better if I had the slides, because I do have some pretty maps and pretty pictures. I do a lot of mapping. So again, the ability to prepare, plan for, absorb, recover from, and essentially successfully adapt to adverse events. And what do I mean by adverse events? Oh, that looks weird. What I mean by that is things like stressors and shocks. So what shocks the way that we carry about our business, how we live our daily lives? I'm sorry about that font. Hopefully that's the only slide that looks like that. So when I use these words, shocks and stresses, I'm thinking about events. Shocks are events that happen kind of on a one-time basis. Think about these as acute or chronic events or illnesses that essentially undermine the way that we carry on activities and the way that we interact with the environment around us. So a shock is something that happens, essentially a short-term event, an acute event, versus a stressor that is a more long-term event. So examples of a shock would be, think back Hurricane Florence, right? That's our most recent shock that was a sudden event that kind of took us by surprise, even though it really shouldn't, because we expect to encounter events like that. But it disrupted our basic services, the way we go about our daily lives, and it caused a lot of human risk. We'll come back to it. And something like a stressor is an event, like I said, more like a chronic illness, something that kind of happens in the background that puts a little bit of pressure in the way that we conduct ourselves and conduct livelihoods, and reduces our overall ability to deal with these bigger shocks. Oh, goodness. Okay, so how about now? So an example of a stressor would be daily or sunny day flooding or high tide flooding, things like that. So basically. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to put both of these together on one slide. Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. And this is all the theory here that you're going to see. The rest of it will be a little bit more, hopefully. But shocks are, again, things that are happening, but both of them actually can happen chronically and acutely more or less at the same time. So we have a shock such as a flood or a hurricane or a hazardous waste spill, versus a stressor would be something, again, that sort of stresses our community over time: poverty, housing shortages, the opioid epidemic, So these are things that are happening slowly, chronically, or more acutely, a financial crisis or a factory closing or losing a hospital, that essentially all contribute to how we adapt and how we build resilience in the face of these environmental extremes. So let's think about a recent shock. So I opened with this story. Think about it as a story, right? This is Wallace, North Carolina. This is in Duplin County. It's a little bit far from us, but not too far away. And the reason I focused on this community is because a few months ago, I was invited to give a talk by our legislators. So our representatives Murphy and Rouser, they organized 2 years in a row, they organized a summit focused on flooding and what we can do about flood resilience. And they really were interested in thinking about, we call it pluvial flooding, but it's this sort of flooding that happens inland away from the coast, and it's caused by rain, right? Which is what happened with Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence wasn't a standard storm event that caused much coastal flooding, right, along the actual coast, but it caused a lot of damage more inland away from the coast. And it's because of the amount of rain that poured over days. So we call that, again, pluvial flooding. So that's what the legislator wanted to hear about. So I wanted to kind of bring home the idea that we have all these places inland that are not prepared or that are not used to thinking about flood risk in any kind of capacity, because if you look at this inset here and you see the red dot is where the center of the city of Wallace is in Duplin County. And if you look underneath of that in blue, in these light blues are the current, what we call special flood hazard areas, or what the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, which everybody's heard of FEMA. This is what FEMA essentially uses to determine who needs assistance in the case of a flood event. And it's also how we plan, right? How we plan our housing and how we plan the various activities that happen in cities, because we say, okay, the areas highlighted in blue are at risk from flooding because they are close to a river. You can see the little Rockfish Creek right there. Everything that's outside of that in that light tan color would not be at risk. So we plan with that. So therefore, that's why I focus on here and started off by thinking, well, the people that were in those tan areas didn't really think about flooding too much. And what that also means that they're not prepared, they're not insured. Again, it's not on the radar. But then Hurricane Florence happened. And then in climate talk, Hurricane Florence was a 1,000-year flood event, which means that the way we plan for an event like this is not that it happens every 1,000 years, but that it has a probability of only happening every so often, meaning very rarely. And when it does, it's a big intensity, it's a big magnitude event. So on the left, on the right, you're right there, there's an animation showing just in those bubbles is the size or the amount of rainfall that we received. And over the course of about 4 days, we actually received the average precipitation for an entire year, more or less, in just those 4 days, which is why it was such a damaging event, which is why when you think back to these tan and blue areas over here, what that means is that these blue areas are predicated on an event, on a 100-year flood event, on an event with a probability of essentially about 0.02% of happening. A 1,000-year flood event essentially means that the boundaries of this floodplain would have to be way outside of that, right? So that's okay. So that's what happened. It was a big event, and then all of a sudden, those people that I had the little pin dropped on right here. I'm sorry, this should be it was a different color in my previous, but this little box here is exactly that area I showed you on my screen with the 10 colors. All of these houses were underwater, okay? Because again, they weren't supposed to, right? They weren't at risk. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time working on with my students and thinking about is the fact that what we used to know as areas of risk, at risk from flooding is changing dramatically. So we have very different landscapes of risk. And what you see here is essentially how we can use satellite data from satellites orbiting in space to look specifically at how we are what's being impacted post an event like that, and what that looks like. So we can very easily, by essentially overlaying two things in these little colors here, we have homes, so we can pinpoint exact locations of homes. We can see what kind of homes they are, mobile homes, single family homes, multi-unit homes. And then we can use satellite data to basically determine where exactly a flood event is impacting. And we can see just in this very tiny box right here, which was representative of what happened with Florence, that of the impacted homes, a large proportion were actually mobile homes, okay? And that has big implications because in typically mobile homes are going to be places that are more socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so what this map shows you here, again, I'm still in the same blue box right there where I started off with, but now I'm showing you essentially that then if we take that data and we look where the waters from Hurricane Florence affected people, and we already know that the majority of them were actual mobile homes. But then if we take that and take it a step further and look at more socioeconomic data, such as poverty or race of who lives in these places, the areas highlighted in red and this very dark red right here, where again, in this very small community, we felt the impact. We actually quantified that the people there were living way below the poverty line and were also primarily African American that were impacted. As it happens, again, just one place, one story, but with this kind of data, we can actually quantify and we can actually look at the fact that and I think we've done some analyses and we've come to see that about up to 40% of the people that were directly impacted by Florence were not necessarily expecting to be, were not living in these flood hazard areas, right? In these areas that are highly at risk. But as it goes, and I'm going to go back to more digestible things, but as it goes, we already knew, and again, still focus on the blue box for now, and I'll come back to some of these. Even before Hurricane Florence, I was doing some work with a couple of former graduate students and a couple of my colleagues, and we had created this model. So we essentially we have at the tip of our fingers these days, we have a lot of data that has location, right, associated with it. So every time you use your phone to drive over here, to get directions, to get anywhere, you're basically using something we call location services. Well, I teach students all about location services, and how I teach them those things is by using these data, right? So one of what you're seeing here is a map, and this map has all these boundaries. Inside, all of these different colors represent something, and we figure out what each color represents based on some quantitative information in the back of it. And that is to say that the places that are showing up as dark black, or dark gray on these maps were areas where we had taken socio-demographic data, such as percent elderly folks, disabilities, people living different poverty levels, different income levels, different racial and ethnic compositions. All of these things we can represent on maps, just like these, with these boundaries, and we call these block groups, right? This is how we vote. You folks in this room should really know about block groups, right? Because when we think about maps and voting, that's how we do that kind of voting. So we essentially took all of that socio-demographic data, and then we took these boundaries of where people are at risk from flooding. And even before Florence happened, we essentially put them together. So we had a model, we had a mental map like this one that told us that, hey, if you live near Camp Lejeune and it's showing up here in black, that means that you're extra vulnerable because, and the reason that folks here are extra vulnerable, they're not only close to the coast, therefore at risk physically from flooding, but they also have really large families with a lot of kids. And they're all sort of piled sort of in that small area together. So that's just an example. Similarly, we already knew these places here near Wallace were at risk along some of those similar lines, but not as much as we ended up experiencing the risk with Hurricane Florence. So where does that leave us? How do we know these things? How do we know who's vulnerable? What place is more vulnerable or less resilient in the face of a disaster than other places? And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take questions now, but maybe let me just get through a few more things because that was a lot. And it was just to kind of pitch the story. It's a complex one. And then hopefully, but if you have questions, I'm happy to take them right now. So how do we know who's vulnerable? Again, it's back to this whole location data. We call it geospatial analysis. Geo for the earth and spatial for things that have essentially a location associated with them. So that's the technical term we use. But basically, if you live in coastal North Carolina, you've signed a contract. By moving here, you're basically putting yourself at risk. I mean, that's just no way to, but realistically, anywhere you live, that you're going to be at some, my mom just experienced a 5.2 Richter scale earthquake this morning, and she lives in Romania in a place that's seemingly not at risk, but they're feeling the after effects of what happened in Turkey and Syria. So anywhere you live, really, you are going to be facing some kind of hazards. But specifically, the coastal North Carolina environment is prone to these hazards and risks because we are very low lying. Our highest elevation ranges from about 0 to 15 feet on average. That we are very low. We are right here where we're standing. We're about 10 feet above sea level. And so later I'll be telling you a little bit about how we account for sea level rise. And we are expecting in the next, with fairly high confidence, in the next 20 years, we're expecting up to 2 feet of sea level rise. So, you know, think about the fact we are standing at 10 feet and we're expecting about 2 feet of sea level rise, 1.5 to 2 feet. That's significant. And look at this whole area, flat, low elevation, flat, with an extensive barrier island and wetlands. And we are doing what to? We are basically replacing with subdivisions left and right? So we are doing that. Then the more we do that, the less protected our coastal system is, and the more we essentially expose ourselves to these risks. And the risks, and not only that, but we are very attractive, right? You asked in the beginning who is from North Carolina. I think we had 3 hands. Okay, everybody else is here just like me, right? We moved here from somewhere else, and we moved here because we know it's a great place to live. But in the same vein, we are expecting about another 1.5 million people moving here in the next 20 years. Where are all these people going to go? We are the fastest growing county in the state, and one of the fastest growing between Brunswick, Pender, and New Hanover. We're one of the fastest growing regions in all of eastern southeastern USA. Well, I know a lot of different factors, but we have all these risks, like I said, storms, coastal flooding, and then sea level rise. This organization called Climate Central, they're also, they're an incredible organization, and many others now. This is a little bit dated, but there's a lot of emphasis being put on trying to understand not only how much sea level we are going to be experiencing, which we already are experiencing sea level rise, but specifically where it's going to be showing up, right? So that's, again, where that spatial information, spatial data is coming from. But specifically, we are here to talk today about flooding and inundation, right? So what causes, and we've already established that we are at risk because of just the physical environment that we live in, flat, low elevation, lots of wetlands. Those wetlands are here in the first place because of how the environment is, flat, no actual elevation. That's why we get wet lands. But then we have hurricanes and coastal storms, right? For example, Floyd 1999. Then we have these flood events that are caused by rainfall that I was showing you the example in Wallace. Again, the flooding in Wallace was caused by heavy rainfall, heavy sustained rainfall over a long period of time. And then we have these events like what Matthew did back in 2016. If you remember, this is a picture of the lower Cape Fear River. You can see the bridge here. And then right after Matthew, the bridge is right here underwater. It was a huge amount of water that came through. And that was flooding that was caused by river overflow. Okay, so we call that riverine flooding. So realistically, we have a lot of different ways that we can flood. And when sometimes these ways come together and they get compounded, and we call that compound flooding. And they even get compounded by those stressor that I showed you in the beginning, we call that the sunny day flooding, right? Anybody here live down in Carolina Beach, you know, Canal Street, some of those places, or Front Street downtown? What do we see there all the time? It doesn't take a rain event to get flooding, right? That's a stressor on our system. That's something that's chronically, right? We have higher water levels from sea level rise, typically, that essentially add to this compound flooding problem. So, my gosh, that was a long time. So essentially, we set out to do some work way back when, about 2016, 15. And I was really curious about whether socioeconomically disadvantaged communities were more at risk from flooding than other communities. That was just, you know, we like to test hypotheses in science. And so we did that. We did a lot of research co-production. We worked over this large 28 county coastal area. And we specifically worked with the COGS, with our Council of Governments. As you know, all of these counties are organized in these councils of governments so that we can actually better plan for events and for things like that. So I'll walk you through a very easy type of analysis that we can do with spatial data to figure out who's at risk, because that's the question I pitched in the beginning, right? How do we know who's vulnerable? How can we create these mental models? So we can essentially take something that we call the base flood elevation. That's that map with the blues and tans I showed you right in the beginning. Those are essentially ways that we can, based on historic events, figure out where a flood is likely to happen and how much a river is going to kind of essentially spill over its channels in the case of any type of flood event. So if we have a structure that, say, was built prior to an effective flood map, we can have something like this, where we can have the finished floor elevation of a house essentially fall below the actual base flood elevation in the case of a potential flood. So a lot of the times, a lot of the structures that were built prior to us requiring that homes be elevated above these base flood levels are in that situation where with only 1 foot of water in the structure of a house, that house is basically considered unlivable because you're damaging electrical outlets and things like that. And then we have situations where the finished floor elevation of a house is above that base flood level. Say if the base flood level is 9 feet and the house is built at 10 feet, then that house is considered safe. Now, guess what? We did an analysis just using that simple math. That's it. Just where the base flood is calculated to be, and just taking a data set that had the finished floor elevation. So how high a house comes above the base flood for all the structures in this whole entire 28 county area. So we looked at about 130,000 structures, just residential homes. And of all of those residential homes, about 45% of them are basically exposed to this very basic 100-year flood event just by the way that they're built. Okay, so that's one way. So we can sort of see that distribution, and then we can also see where those places are, primarily in the areas that are most at risk, typically in the coastal area. But we also see some going inland, right, along the main river networks. So this is a very easy and completely objective way of essentially looking just based on the structure of how a home was built, whether it's potentially vulnerable or not. These are the kinds of things that ought to be disclosed when a buyer buys a home, but not everybody knows to look this up and to figure out, am I at risk? What kind of risk am I at? And then I said that we took all of this census data, and I'm not going to go over all the details, but just know that when I say we took census data, we had over 3,000 variables, and we looked over 1,000 plus block groups. Essentially, all of these are the counties I showed you, many, many variables. Again, variables that include ethnicity, incomes, and things like that. And we had created this map. This was that mental model I mentioned earlier when I showed you the Wallace example. And we could essentially pretty much figure out roughly where people were at risk. Again, the black and dark gray areas are places where we have people who are both considered socially vulnerable by virtue of maybe not having access to transportation, or maybe being renters, or maybe being elderly, or maybe having, so all of these are having multiple children and a single female-headed household, all of these kinds of things that typically tend to make groups more vulnerable than other groups. And then we also intersected that with that simple math of how a house was built, how high above the base flood elevation a house was built. And that's how we could come up with something like this that can be used for planning purposes to say, okay, let's go investigate what's happening here downtown Wilmington. This is right across the river. This is the Navassa Leland community. We already know people that are vulnerable, but with these data, we can actually drill down to the block group level and see, okay, which block groups are more vulnerable? Again, the ones in black would be more so than others. And then we can ask questions about the environmental justice or injustice and things like that. But then essentially, this is a picture of, so this is a static picture. This is what it is now. But what is going to happen when research is showing that in the next 10 years or so, we are expecting 63% more days at risk from hurricane-induced flooding. That's a lot. So say if we flood once every 3 years now, we're going to be flooding 63% more. So we can flood every year from right in the future, just because of the atmospheric dynamics and the things we've put in motion in our planet. And also another stark fact is that about 70% of homes, especially some of these homes inland, right? These places that are inland that they're not necessarily planning for risk and for coastal hazards in the same way, are single family or manufactured homes that are under or uninsured altogether. So those alone are huge problems. And then again, something like Florence happens, and we experienced, billions of dollars in residential flood homes, and about 75,000 homes flooded. Remember when I showed you earlier, and when we looked only, this is the finished floor elevation, right below here. So when we just look at that, only in the 100-year floodplain, that area that we plan to be at risk in, we had about 54,000 structures that were at risk, but more than 75,000 of these structures actually flooded in Florence, which means people who are not expecting to be at risk were flooded. And so we were able to show that, here's an example from Pender County, 42% of the buildings that flooded in Pender County were not in the high risk area. Okay, that's basically the take home message. That again, 42%, that's a lot. That's almost half of the impacted homes did not expect to be impacted, were not insured, and they were not prepared, right? And again, this is just in Pender. And then in a place like New Bern, which is another area that I've worked in a lot. And what we're showing here, these numbers, these buildings, they are actually numbers coming from the county itself. The county collected this data after Florence. Similarly, in a place like New Bern, the colors here represent what our mental model that I just explained had said would be at risk. So the stuff in red, we just using the finished floor data and socioeconomic variables, we had said these would be the places at risk. And then when Hurricane Florence happened and the city went around and actually counted and collected data on which homes were damaged, 98.2% of the homes that were actually damaged in Florence fell in these red areas that our simple analysis said is at risk. So that's, that's kind of, so the point is, we know who is at risk. We can very straightforwardly, and these are very simple models. This is nothing super fancy as far as the science behind it, but we can, with fairly good confidence now, create very exact models to show what's flooded, where, and how. And again, so these categories here are not only physical exposure to risk, the actual water itself, but also taking into account the demographics and the socioeconomic characteristics of those communities. And we can, like I said, we can plan. We know how to do this. And so I'll just give you one more little snippet of Florence. This right here, this map, so I'm zooming out now. I'm zooming out a little bit to look at the entire area that was impacted by Florence. And this is from a paper, I'm sorry, you can't read it, but it's from a paper not by me, but this is data done by, this is by another group. Anything in blue here is essentially the maximum flood extent of flooding from Hurricane Florence. That's a lot, right? And again, these are our main river networks right here, the Cape Fear and Black, and then and so your Neuse and all those places. So we can recognize the geography. We would expect all these places to flood, right, to some extent, all the tidal creeks along here that we can see. But then what we did, and then again, so Florence happened in 2018, and then we took 2020. So my colleague Joanne Halls and I did this. So we took 2020 census data, okay? And you know, census data is how we get all of our socioeconomic information. And so we did, again, a very simple analysis. All the boundaries on here are block groups, okay? How we aggregate data in the census, And we did a calculation. So here we're only showing 8 of the most impacted counties, coastal counties that were affected by Florence, right? So New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, Onslow, and some of the others. But the most of the impact was down here, Brunswick, New Hanover, Pender, and Onslow. And so we looked at this entire area with the most recent census data, and we calculated things like the mean and the median income. And we looked at just the proportion. Again, we only use two metrics, but we can use a lot. The proportion of African Americans in this group. And so essentially, we're just looking at the income. So the mean income for this entire 8-county area was about $52,000. And then all the areas highlighted in yellow, in blue here, darker blue, and the purple are essentially places where the income, where the mean income is larger, right, than the average. So it's larger than that $52,000, which we'd expect, right? You see the coast. We know the people that can afford to live at the coast will make a lot more money. So we see this pattern right here. And then we notice that the areas in light blue are the places where the majority income is actually less than the mean. This is a funny way of saying, but just take away that the stuff in the light blue are the people that make less than $52,000 a year for the household. Now, I mean, something like this essentially challenges the notion that most of the risk experienced from flooding or even storms is going to be at the coast, because the people living at the coast tend to usually afford to live at the coast, make more money, right? And essentially have a little bit more buffering capacity in the case of a natural hazard than the folks that are more inland that make less money and things like that. So we wanted to look again, how just are these, environmentally just are these patterns that we can observe from data. So again, this is independent of Florence, but this is what it is. If you just look at income, mean income, 52,000, and you color this map with who makes more, who makes about the mean, and who makes less, that's what it looks like, okay? That's straightforward enough. And then if we take the people that were flooded and we do the same kind of thing, again, the darker blue is are the places that essentially experienced more flooding in and of itself, okay, that's it. Dark blue, more flooding from Florence, as in the example. And then if we bring these two together, so essentially, again, this is the power of spatial data. We can combine these things. It's essentially like we're adding apples and oranges, but well, in this case, they're apples and apples, but we can combine them together and get out something like this, okay? And I just want to spend a couple seconds in here focusing on one kind of take-home message as far as who's vulnerable. And our communities, is this exposure to risk environmentally just? Is there, and I'm sorry you can't really see, but essentially on this graphic here, you'll see in this light gray is the percent area flooded from Florence for the entire 8-county area, okay? So the white line. And then in these lines, so we've already established that the people living inland are in the rural areas are obviously make less money than the folks at the coast, simplistically speaking. But if we look at the percent flooding overall, and then the percent non-white, so this includes African-American communities, Hispanic communities, any other, we see that essentially about the areas that are most impacted were over 40% non-white, as it happens with Hurricane Florence, okay? As it happens, I say as it happens. But essentially all the places that are in these red colors on our maps are places where more than 45% of the block group was flooded by Florence. And that block group was also both non-white and essentially was made less than 52,000 or that mean income per year. So again, these are big patterns, and you know, we have the ability to zoom into these and really look at what's going on downtown and what's going on across the river and what's going on up in Duplin. But any place that shows up red like that is a place that this is no longer a mental model based on just data. This is based on something that actually happened, right? Florence. Again, the redder it is, the larger of an area of this little color, and this is Duplin County where I started off, Wallace, was flooded, and also that red highlights the fact that we have both high social vulnerability, so lots of rural communities that live near or below the poverty line, and areas that are at high risk. So we can dig into these maps more, but essentially that's where we stand, right? That's kind of where we stand, and yes.
Status, or does it include that elevation?
Doesn't. So what's the, does vulnerability include only socioeconomic, and what else? Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that, yes. Yeah, so the question is, does vulnerability include only socioeconomic data, or does it also include the physical environment, right? Elevation, or where you are in the floodplain, essentially your raw exposure based on where in the environment you find yourself. And yes, the way that I've been defining, and I'm sorry I didn't specifically say that, but I said that we intersected both the physical exposure, right, that elevation where you live, and the socioeconomic. So combined, they are what makes somebody vulnerable or less resilient overall. But yes, typically, and here too, here actually it's a little different, but that's a great question, because in this map, so the previous map, it was vulnerability was both combined, but in this map, we try to keep it a little separate, where risk is that actual who got flooded by Florence. This is exactly Florence. And vulnerability here, vulnerability doesn't include all the many variables that we did for that mental model. It only includes percent non-white and people who live below a certain or close to the poverty line. So just these two, income and percent non-white. Again, in this example, yeah, the previous, yeah. Yeah. Sure, and yes, yeah. It can be, yes, no, it's a very good observation. And it really can be defined and can be computed differently depending on, but here we thought it'd be, yeah, no, that's a very good observation. Yes.
How did Bald Head Island get red?
I know, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question was, how does Bald Head Island get red? And actually, I've gotten this question once before. And the explanation is that across from Bald Head Island, right on the other side of it's capturing. So it's not just Bald Head Island, but it's across. So but that's a wonderful observation. And again, this is what we can get from the census data that we have available. But in order to create much more refined analyses and much more refined to figure out exactly with more definition who's at risk and where and how, we sometimes have to drill deeper, further inward into those block groups. But yes, that's definitely, yes. Okay.
I think we need to alternate because we're running out of time.
Yeah. I just have,
I think it's only fair to all.
I just have a couple slides left.
Did you want to finish?
Okay, I can stop at the end. And so then I want to leave it on what are some ways communities can actually build resilience. Okay, so this is all good and nice. We can look at maps and we can make analyses all day long. And like I said, we can drill deeper into a lot of these, but what are some ways? And I had a few other examples, but and I'm not a community organizer. This is not my area of expertise, but these are some steps that as a community, as stakeholders, as locals in an area, we can actually start taking to start addressing and building resilience in our community. So the first thing we can do is community engagement. So we talk about this, we meet together, we sit down and you tell me, well, that map doesn't look right. So I have a project right now that is going to be doing over the course of the summer exactly this. We are going to drill deeper into these maps, make more accurate models, mental models, and then go ask and get feedback and get information about how those are working out. So community engagement, public and private infrastructure goals linked to resilience. We basically, as a community, we just need to ask to plan better and to do better and to really consider resilience in all aspects of how we build in the future, how we retrofit existing structures, what infrastructure we put in place, where and how, and things like that. We can also do better with community preparation. Again, we know which places are at risk, but we still haven't done much about our hurricane evacuation routes, our hurricane shelters. We know that I-40 is going to flood, right? We haven't really done all that much to address that. So there are many things that we know that are choking points, essentially, that we can just continue to do better. So, and then we can do better with land use planning. And this includes how we build, where we build, what and I really admire everybody in this room, and I think everybody is very engaged, and I wish I could be more engaged in these things, but I think there's a lot of pressure that we can put on our local politicians, on our decision makers to plan and to implement better land use planning, better building codes, and better building standards overall. And so I'll leave you with one other thought here. A lot of what I'm hinting at with a lot of this is this whole area called nature-based solutions. Nature-based, so building with nature, engineering with nature differently instead of, and I had an interview on WHQR last week, and I talked about that a little bit, how we essentially build not on top of nature, strip nature away, build and let things kind of fall in place, but build with nature better. And that will essentially help not only with the resilience, so not only help the people and the planet, but it actually can help the bottom line. So we call it the triple bottom line. Okay, so it doesn't have to be the environment or the bottom line. It can be both. And we can sort of, again, this is something that you as an organization can start also advocating for a little bit more. And I had this very simple, essentially, example or the graphic that shows that, hey, how we make decisions up in the rural low density areas versus in the suburban regions, right? So think rural areas up there, up in the headwaters of some of our tributaries, or in places across the river on either side in Brunswick or Onslow, or in the deep urban place, will affect what actually happens. And I want to leave you on this picture, though, taken from downtown Atlanta, essentially, that shows a brownfield site that was doing nothing but concentrate stormwater and essentially act as a massive hazard when it comes to flooding. And this was essentially retrofitted with these nature-based principles into an incredible park that, again, not only helps contain the water, but has some constructed wetlands that act as sponges that keep the water in place, help it infiltrate, help it but it's also pretty, and it's also something we can use as a community recreationally, and something that we can build other infrastructure around, and yet essentially address both resilience and the bottom line at the same time. And I'll stop there. And I will take any questions. Yes.
Officials actually taking this data and being proactive with it and making progress?
Yes, I'm happy to say. Yeah. Oh, yes. I'll repeat the question. The question is, have we found a local decision makers essentially take this data and do something with it? And yes, it's actually very encouraging. It was a battle a few years ago to get that engagement and that traction, but over the last few years, both the county, New Hanover County specifically, also Pender we've worked with, even Brunswick County across the river, especially the town of Leland, have reached out. So we are working together. And none of these things I've showed you here today have happened independently. All of them have happened with some level of engagement with the county and the city, and they're all on board. And as far as our long-range planners and our the folks at the county and the city that are thinking about infrastructure, and they're thinking about how we plan and how we zone, everybody's thinking about these issues now. But yes, they're still, no, it's hard to know. What is hard to know, I think, from their perspective is what do we prioritize? Where do we start implementing some of these things? It's hard to know, because if you go around the community, everybody wants it right in their backyard. So one of the projects that I have right now that is actually funded by NASA is to work with the city and the county to try to use data to objectively prioritize locations, and then go and speak to the community and look at the community members and see, would that be a good idea? Is this something that the county or the city should pursue? So these are the kinds of projects that now, as an academic institution, we're working collaboratively, because we can't, none of these things, again, are worthwhile if they happen without that input. Yes.
This is a question from Zoom. Can people in the room hear me? So this is from Veronica Carter, who's actually a Leland Town Council member.
Okay.
And she says, many of the areas that are most vulnerable do not have the manpower, planner/staff, and bandwidth to apply for and manage the programs that are available through the state and federal government. Is there a way for universities and researchers to join together with these local communities to assist in their planning and or obtaining existing grants to assist in these areas?
Well, tell Veronica to please send me an email, and tell Veronica that I literally was just telling Beth earlier that I'm working right now. I just left Brent Hell again at home because we're putting together a proposal for about $1.5 million with 2 universities out in the west of the state to do exactly that. To say, how do we take all of this data and all of this information that we have and assist communities who don't have the manpower or the ability to, sometimes the actual ability to leverage some of these data, because it does take some training, right? And we want to identify, we want to work with Brunswick, Pender, and New Hanover to identify potential locations where we can go in and collect even drone data and then give it to engineers to create concept designs similar to this. This is why I ended on this note, because we think that's exactly where we want to be heading next, especially with the huge amount of funding that's coming from the federal government in the way of infrastructure development. But that's what I was hinting at with my answer, right? Oftentimes the community does not have a way of objectively prioritizing where these interventions should go in. And that's exactly what we are working on with the community right now. Yes.
So I'm actually an academic that's unemployed, and I'm looking to start nonprofits that are employing what geographers do to help communities, serve justice to, issues like this. And I'm talking about gun violence, I'm talking about drug violence, not just vulnerabilities and flood planning. One of the things out of Veronica's county is Oak Island actually has started an ordinance that says that they need every new build and every significant land impact construction, new construction or new build has to have a stormwater management system. So understanding how actually now the shift is to the individual homeowner is a really kind of powerful impact. We have things called smart yards that our county, our state has information about, but there isn't somebody who's out there kind of telling council members, telling the public and being that way person. So I'm here to essentially plug that I'd love to join this organization and help do that. But I know Narcissa because essentially I also was a teacher at UNCW and I come from California where the disparity of coastal versus, the suburban,
Inland,
the
yeah.
urban, the flooding. So, we do have people that, are going to bridge that gap. So I'd love to join in on that too.
Were there-
I'm just curious, it's like, I like the plan and everything, but like, to me, it's, you've got to get the developers on board.
Oh, yes.
Those guys are, and I see it in Brunswick County,
Yes,
like they'll
yes,
fill in a
yes.
wetland. in a heartbeat.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah, and they don't, and stormwater runoff, they don't care as long as it doesn't, as long as they can get it off their property and their development, they're
yeah,
happy.
yeah.
I mean, that's what I see there. They're,
Which is why we have to demand better, right? I mean, ultimately, as I said, if we do things a little, and I even said this on my interview in WHQR last week, I don't think that there's evil intent necessarily. Like we always tend to pitch developers as, oh, they're evil, they're developers, they're a whole different breed of people that are driven by the bottom line, right? Which, everybody's ultimately, we all have to make a bottom line if you do something, right? But I think it's more to, if we need to figure out ways to calculate exactly how much more would it cost up front to put in something like this as opposed to just a bulkhead, right? And show that, hey, even though it may take a little bit more money up front to do so, but again, the maintenance doesn't fall on the developer. So realistically, that's where the disconnect is. The maintenance, though, over the long term is much less, and the sustainability is longer. So I think we just have to connect that short and the long term somehow, but I don't know how we would do that.
I'm just, I'm not trying to nice developers.
No, I know, but
Oh, no.
It's not. With the developers in Brunswick County, I mean, it's every time in Oak Island when they come, well, we'd like you to leave the trees on the lot.
Yeah.
They said, no, we can cut all the trees down because we own it. So,
Yeah.
they're.
Well, yeah, there's ordinances. I just want to tell you, just to tell you the knowledge thing. Do you know that New Hanover County has an ordinance that says that you have to apply? And yet, lawyers, developers, all of those, I worked at a law office. So that's the thing is that I'm not only an academic, I worked in the law and with real
Right.
estate. So I was a real estate paralegal.
so essentially we do have to figure out ways that we can engage everybody in a productive conversation and get everybody on board to do better.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would do that.
One other question from Zoom is, if governmental units need to set priorities, what should we do first?
Yes, I don't necessarily know. I don't represent that field per se, so I can't say what we need to do first. Maybe deal with our biggest issues, right? Stormwater impacts, because that ultimately translates to, it has effects downstream, as so to speak, effects. And then again, you ask different people, everybody's going to have a different priority. So it's hard to say, I don't know.
I think elevation is very important, and that is something
politically that you never see. I mean, when we're trying to develop that marsh off the river, you know, and the elevation was below sea level. Well, that came up, but even the average person that's buying a house, if you ask what the elevation is,
Nobody knows, yeah?
You can't find it. It's nowhere to be found. I mean, if it can be found, it's not the average.
It's not immediate, yes.
And the realtors never know, and the owners never know.
Well,
And maybe with
they
new,
know.
they want to sell the house, but
know.
developments, it seems like it should be required that
yes,
builders
yes.
publish the
Yes.
elevation of the property.
And
I think going forward, that is something.
yes, so the,
to understand.
yeah, the comment is about essentially publishing or requiring builders and realtors to disclose the elevation of a structure and its risk level actually. And there are tools out there that allow us to do that. I can send some follow-up tools. You can put in your address and you can map exactly what your elevation is and what your risk level. These tools exist, but again, it's a matter of education sometimes and getting that information. So this is why I'm very happy that you've invited me, and hopefully I get the chance to maybe talk to others and share that kind of information. It would be helpful. Okay.
Okay, one last question from Zoom, which is, what measures can we do globally to ensure homes are resilient to floods, which raised dramatically during decades due to the ocean level risen, especially green infrastructures as a global solution, not just local scale?
Looking for a global scale approach rather than just these local issues.
Well, that's a good question, but I mean, think about, we just talked here about Pender, New Hanover, and Brunswick, and we just established how hard it is to get these traction on these things at the local level. I have thought a lot about the global level stuff, and then I decided that the places, if all local areas on the coast would do their part or a part, then as a global community, we would overall increase our resilience. But I don't think there's not even an ordinance that we can give in North Carolina that everybody will apply equally, let alone something at the federal level or the global level. So I mean, I think the answer really is looking more like it's in the local hands. But then there are, of course, organizations that are global that do their part in capacity building and education, but it still comes down to the local level to some extent. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, don't go anywhere. Okay, so I'm taking the microphone away because we need to bring this to a close, but I do want to say we had many comments in the chat for, yes, the risk assessment tools that you mentioned. And so if you registered on Zoom, we have your contact information and we can send that to you if Dr. Prokopa gives it to us. If you're, that's a better way to do it. Okay, in fact, and so if you're in the room, if you could make sure that you signed in and gave us your email address, then we can do the same thing. And just to repeat, if you're on Zoom, if you just send an email now to communications@lwvlcf.org and indicate that you'd like to have a copy of these assessment tools, then we can send them to you. If they want it, yeah. Okay, so if you signed in here, just put a little star next to your name and we'll know to send it to you. And if you send us an email because you're on Zoom, then we'll know to send it to you. Okay, yes, we want to thank you so much for being with us today. I think there's going to be a lot of follow-up on this. Okay, and that's it. We are, for those who would like to, we'll continue this conversation down the street in McAllister's Deli. Oh, closing slide. Can you do that? Oh, yes, that's right. Okay. So yes, I forgot. So thank you for joining us. We did record this. And so if you know there's someone who would like to benefit from this and didn't get to participate today, either in person or on Zoom, it can be found on our website and YouTube page. Membership in the league is open to everyone. We have student memberships and several dues options. And if you want to get more information on us, please go to our website, lwvlcf.org. Thank you very much for coming today.